to see whether they also came up with the same interpretation. So sometimes you might get different interpretations, and that's okay. It depends on your interpretivist view. You might particularly have a viewpoint that you want to have your own slant on it. You know, you look at the world with a particular lens. Sometimes you might want to have some more consistency about the data, and it depends on your purpose. So I think NVivo is very good for that kind of process, and if you write a paper and they get, you know, comments back and say, could you provide some more evidence? If it's in NVivo, it's much easier to go back to it, you know, a year later. If it's all on post-its and you know, scraps of paper, it's much harder. A drawback of NVivo is that it has a tendency to crash. And if you put a lot of data in, I've got another PhD student who's finished that put in photos and all sorts, and every time that she tried to put too much data in, it just fell over and she hated it. So it's not very stable. There's also issues switching between math and PC, which you probably get on lots of things. So it's a very good piece of software if you've got very complex data that you want multiple analysis and analysis over time, if you're patient with it.
Can I add something? I actually ended up using NVivo for my PhD, and I come from a purely technical background, so it was a bit of a learning curve for me. Yeah. The one thing I did kind of want to say is it's only as good as the data that goes into it, so you really have to kind of transcribe your interviews. You have to have a really nice structure to your interviews as well, even if they're unstructured, to enable you to kind of make sense of the data. It's no use just importing everything in there and having a big jumble of words that mean absolutely nothing. So it is a bit of a steep learning curve. And again, I think anything less than 10 interviews, you're probably better off doing it manually. It works just as well, I think.
Could I just sort of say something and linking that to quantitative as well, because essentially I think we often don't talk about it sufficiently in quantitative work. And in fact, when I went out looking for a book on the topic, I found a grand total of one, which was essentially about exactly the process that Vicky was talking about, that we all do when we're doing quantitative work as well, and that very often doesn't get documented maybe as thoroughly as it could, and maybe isn't to the forefront of the researcher's mind as much as it could be in terms of the effect of the researcher in terms of structuring the data. And Vicky and I were chatting about this in the coffee break before, the impact that then can have on the analysis if you decide, because very often, I'm sure you would agree with this, David, very often you can be in a position with quant data where it's not completely clear whether this should be classified as an X type of wall or building or heating system or whatever. It could be classified as X, but there's also some countervailing arguments where it could be classified as Y. And you end up making those decisions, if you like, but very often that isn't necessarily recorded, and it's not often brought to the forefront of the mind as well with the researcher when they're coming to interpret their findings. That with qualitative work, it's much more sort of to the forefront of the interpretivist approach is recognised, it's part of the research, you're expected to write it up. And in quantitative research, there can be a bit of encouraging to sort of brush that under the carpet and forget that actually, as I sort of say to my students, your footprints are all through the data, irrespective of whether you've taken a quantitative approach, a modelling approach, or a qualitative approach. And it's just checking out where your footprints are.
Okay, yeah, speaker.
Can I have a comment on this thing that bugs me a lot of times? I do mixed method. There is use the approach, the mixed method approach, and I feel that there is a different language that I have to use when I present to the quantitative people and the qualitative people, and that I have to defend it in both ways. And do you also find that this is something that this kind of researcher, it's the extra element of difficulty, and you have to learn two new languages and know when to use them? And how do you deal with that?
I personally think it's a strength. I personally think we all need to be justifying our methods far more than we do. And I think in the social sciences there is, to some extent, more of a tradition of that. But when I'm teaching, those of you who've done the MSc EPI, Economics and Policy of Energy and Environment would know, I get the students who are going to be doing modelling to be justifying why it is that they're doing modelling. And I think that simply we don't do enough of it in our field. And I think those of you who are using mixed methods are strengthening your ability to justify each and every approach. And I think essentially the rest of us need to be learning from that, because we all need to be justifying why we're taking our particular approach. the strengths and necessary limitations of whatever approach we take.
Richard?
Yeah, thanks. I guess the question is really about the impact of research. I was talking in the break about whether different types of research or different methodological approaches are more suited to kind of impact activities, particularly in the context of research councils wanting things to have impact. So I just wonder whether the panel or the audience thought particular types of research were easier to have impact, if that makes sense. Easy to make have impact.
Well, so there are often calls for evidence that we're asked for, and I think if you measure enough stuff well enough, that can definitely be called evidence. That's my own thought.
I mean, I was thinking, we're doing research into energy, fundamentally linked with issues of poverty, pure poverty, and climate change. It's impacting all over it, really, no matter where you come at it from, what angle you take on it, or what specific research.
Okay, so be more specific then. How do you make an ethnographic study have as much impact on future energy systems?
What do you mean by, what do you mean in terms of, do you mean trying to justify a particular approach to policymakers, or do you mean looking at the impact that an ethnographic study might have on blah, blah, blah?
Both.
Both. Okay, with policymakers, essentially a lot of it is upskilling policymakers. One of it is essentially the sorts of points that Lady was talking about in terms of learning to justify the approach. I mean, there are a lot of research questions out there for which it is absolutely stupid to try to use quantitative methods, because either we don't even have a sensible research question around it, we don't have any qualitative data whatsoever. If we don't have any idea of what's going on, or the sorts of issues that are coming up, then it is absolutely pointless and stupid to try and measure something quantitatively we have no idea about. So we don't even have the first idea of what the relationships are, of what the issues are, or anything, or whether that is a sufficiently important issue, research topic to put some more quantitative work into. So there's a vast number of research topics in our field where we can't say anything quantitatively. Once you've actually done some really nice qualitative work, or someone else has kindly done it for you, and worked out, well, this is a clear research question, then once you've narrowed it down beautifully, as Moira made it point beautifully, once you've got a really clear theory of exactly what, and you have a very clear measure, someone's already done all of that effort of working out, how do we define X, Y, and Z, and how are we going to measure X, Y, and Z? So all of that previous thinking work has been done for you. Then you can be in a position to do something quantitatively. But if you jump the gun, which I personally think that we have often done in our field, then really what you're spitting out can be a lot of nonsense. It might have numbers, might be numbered nonsense, but it still could be nonsense. So I think that the argument for, in terms of impact, is simply being clear about the power of different methods.
Okay, anyone else? Yes, Beck.
Can I develop on that a little bit and ask an additional question? Okay, so different types of research can have impact, but if different approaches to research are recognised to be traditionally suited to this area, how does one go about performing that research?
I just want to go back to performing.
Yeah, achieving, getting funding, having backing to do work that isn't recognised necessarily, traditionally, as being able to contribute to that field.
One struggles.
I think there's a growing understanding in this particular area that there is a range of methods, and you look at the spread of projects that are being funded now to show that from ethnographic explorations, really early explorations, through to very detailed monitoring studies, to sophisticated models and so on, and everything across the board. I think within our sector is recognised that these things are of interest, and there's a growing acceptance that we need to understand both the whole spectrum. So I think we have much less of a problem than that football?
It's by accident.
Was it a goal, Steve?
2-1.
2-1.
Can I just ask you, was there a particular, were you talking about ethnography particularly, or did you have something else in mind?
Yes. Yeah, let's be honest, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think increasingly ethnography is recognised as an approach that is useful in understanding about energy demand. So I think there are other studies who are already establishing that as an acceptable method. It's probably in collaboration with more readily established approaches, and therefore you get cross multi-interdisciplinary projects, depending on the combinations. But I think ethnography definitely is accepted as an approach that is useful, and your research is demonstrating that as well.
But I think it raises a really important point that with EPSRC, Tej has said to me, imagine. Essentially you've got a bunch of old blokes sitting around the table, and they're straight engineers. They want someone to go and bang a piece of metal and or do whatever.
We're sure that was disgraceful.
I'm paraphrasing Tej. And essentially you put some interesting social science research in front of them, although it might essentially be the core subject area of interest to EPSRC, so therefore it's less likely to get funding from ESRC, for instance. So it might be a core subject area for EPSRC. The methods might not be what they're used to, the theories might not be what they're used to, etc., etc. So it can be, I just think, it can be challenging when one falls between stools. Bob, you had something you wanted to say on that?
I was just going to say that there seem to be periods in the history of science where paradigms take up arms against each other. And to me that's often very negative, quite destructive, and impedes good work being done at the boundaries of scientific perspectives. And in our area, the boundaries are often the most fruitful places to look for problems and solutions. But conversely, those paradigm wars tend to settle down eventually, and one hits periods of relative peace where the paradigms, the communities that espouse them appear to be content to live with each other, and sometimes, goodness me, even collaborate. And that's good.
Moira, did you have a question? We've got time for one more.
I was just going to say that in social science, in political science, where I came from before I started energy, there was a big sort of paradigm battle between the positivist quantitative researchers and the interpretivist qualitative, and I know those two categories don't always go hand in hand. And someone wrote, it was called the Perestroika letter, and someone wrote this letter to complain to the journal to say it's almost like you can't get published unless you're, measuring voting or measuring attitudes quantitatively. And it was, there was a big debate about it. And I've noticed in the political science public policy area now, when you look at research jobs, qualitative skills and experience is now listed as an essential skill, along with quantitative. And I've not noticed that, sort of 3 or 4 years ago, and now I've noticed it. So I think within that area, it's being seen now as qualitative is really important, because otherwise, why would it be listed as an essential skill? And I've also heard of organisations losing, so where the bid has been for some research in the transport area, for example, where there's been a qualitative and quantitative element as requested by the person asking for the work, and then this particular organisation didn't win the work because they couldn't demonstrate sufficient experience in the qualitative area, partly I think driven by this very strong reputation as quantitative randomised control trial people. So I think it's changing.
We have got time for one more short comment. Each of you, if you have anything? No? Okay. I think we'll leave it there. We've got time for a 5-minute break before we come back for our keynote speaker. But I'd just like to thank the panel for their contributions today.